Well, I'm so excited because our guest today is the VP of Growth and Marketing for Confident Cannabis, a wholesale cannabis platform that connects cannabis cultivators, laboratories, and retailers. And he's also the former GM of the Cannabis, a cannabis news outlet powered by the Denver Post, and the former co-host of Nerd AF, a weekly podcast all about things nerd. Please welcome Brad Bogus. Brad, thanks so much for being here today, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Montel.
Absolutely. We've got a lot to talk about, an explanation of what some of these things are, but let's talk a little bit about, your company that is Confident Cannabis, this wholesale cannabis platform that connects cannabis cultivators, laboratories, and retailers. What exactly do you do, and what states are you operating in?
Yeah, so we're a software company. We intended to solve what we identified as being the biggest problem in cannabis, and that was the biggest problem we could solve with some software. The biggest problems that we heard from cannabis operators nationwide were federal legalization and banking were a big problem. But the third biggest problem that they told us was that wholesale trading is just way too hard, that it's hard to trust who is a good player, who's a bad player. It's hard to trust lab results, or that something has even been tested at a lab and is safe and pesticide free, or even test at the potency that they say that it tests for. And then there was just like some of the basic logistics of wholesale trading that sucked. And, that's text messaging and phone calls and emails and like this endless stream of communication that it requires to build a good relationship in the cannabis industry. And so we sought out to fix that problem. Our wholesale marketplace is the evolution of many years worth of work connecting to laboratories, arming them with software, and accruing tested lab results from across the nation. We now work with over half the labs nationwide. We get test results passed through our system, through those labs every single day, and we get to see all this cannabis chemistry. And for us, this was like the missing piece to making wholesale trading online really work for cannabis companies. By connecting those lab test results to a company's inventory, you can trust what you see. Transparency is above board. You know what things test for, and you know that everybody's licensed and in the system correctly, in the regulatory system. So, go ahead.
No, this is more of a B2B initiative when it comes to software, correct?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Consumers can't use our wholesale platform, but all of the products that they buy in stores come from retailers buying cannabis from other cannabis companies through a platform like ourselves, or just through relationships that they build on their own. So yeah,
let's make sure though that we identify for, because I got a lot of consumers who actually tune into Let's Be Bud, and they need to understand that you are connecting people within each state, because currently we cannot transport cannabis across state lines. And that's something that needs to actually be said and stated, unless it is a black market product.
That's right. And in fact, we actually are dealing with a lot of these types of issues that are happening with counterfeit products, where a product that has been shipped across state lines and is being sold on the illicit market will be using the same packaging or the same test results as a licensed product, say from California. And that's sort of critical in this whole, current news cycle around the vaping crisis. But aside from that, we're arming those businesses within each state. The way that cannabis is regulated requires each state to have its own set of regulations, and everything stays contained within that state. So
meaning just so again, let's slow you down for just a second, because we got listeners, and I want them to understand. That means that, guys, as you listen in, what Brad is talking about is the fact that each individual state that you're in should have its own grow, its own processing, its own packaging, and contained within that state. So if you're buying cannabis in Maryland, the cannabis that you buy in Maryland shouldn't be cannabis that's been, so you've been told, well, we brought this in from California. That's a lie.
That's right.
If it was brought in from California, then you can't trust what you see on the labels of that packaging. You really can't. And I'll refer to a report I saw last week on one of the network news programs that, they tested something like 18 different products in one particular state and found out that, they were finding chemicals in high quantities of cyanide in various products. And also looking at the way people are processing materials and processing cannabis. You may see a brand that you saw in a dispensary in Los Angeles or in San Francisco that was at a legitimate dispensary in California. You may see that brand on a shelf in another state and think, oh, this must be the same product. Doesn't necessarily have to be. That product could be a black market product that has been packaged and labeled in somebody's basement in this other state using the same product packaging that you saw in California, correct?
That absolutely. I mean, look, I grew up in Texas and started using cannabis in Texas, and I can tell you that Texas still isn't regulated. So the products that we got in Texas rarely ever were created in Texas. There definitely wasn't lab testing happening on those products. There was no safety. There was no check and balance. There was no way for me as a consumer to know that I wasn't putting poison in my body. And that still continues to this day. I mean, some of the biggest brands in California are constantly being counterfeited or sold over state lines when some of their product is not passing compliant test results, which means that they're either failing for heavy metal components inside the cannabis, or they're failing for, formaldehyde or pesticides, and like some things that nobody would ever want to put into their body willingly. But when you are in a state that's, still not regulated, or if you're in a regulated state but getting product from a different state, you can't be assured that stuff isn't there.
Correct. And you can't be assured that it's really the product that you think it is. I mean, you can find a brand name, again, in California, a brand name in D.C., and think that that's the same brand name when you see it in Ohio or you see it in Florida, and it isn't. And,
that's right.
And I defy anybody to be able to tell me, oh, it's the exact same product, because if it is, that means that the people that are actually trying to wholesale it are breaking about 5 or 6 federal laws by bringing it across state lines, and then by repackaging it and not testing it. So you really have to be concerned. And I'm telling you, I think you mentioned earlier when I said tell me a little bit about Confident Cannabis. You said we were trying to fulfill one of the top needs in the industry, and I agree with you. I think that educating the wholesalers and educating the businesses is important, but I really think that the number one need right now in this industry is educating the consumer. Let's back up for a second. Let's back up a little bit for a second, Brad. Why don't you talk a little bit? How did you even end up becoming a part of the cannabis industry?
That's a good question. And the funny thing is that you can talk to 1,000 different cannabis industry operators and get 1,000 different insurance stories. But essentially, it all kind of comes to intention. I was a startup founder in Austin, Texas for about 11 years. And, I just came to a point where I wanted to try something new, and I wanted to try something exciting, and I wanted to do something that really mattered. And I talked with a mentor of mine and asked, hey, how do you figure out what you want to be when you grow up? And, I was like, I know I have all these skills. I have all this stuff that I've been doing over the last, 11 years of my career. Where should I take it? And he's like, make it easy on yourself. Pick one industry that you just really seem interested in, that just captures your fancy, and then just look for opportunities there. And I was like, well, that's easy. It's cannabis. And he was like, wow, well, you didn't have to think about that. Why is it cannabis? And I was like, well, I mean, I've been using it for 10 years personally, but I also know a ton about it. There's, the fact that we've been lied to about what this plant can do for us for so many years, and now we're starting to figure that out through science and through experimentation and just activism really excites me. There's a social justice element to this where we can actually correct the wrongs and the evils that our society has wrought on its citizenry over the war on drugs. There's so many components that make cannabis interesting to me, and I think it's just like, there's only once in a lifetime opportunity that a new industry starts from scratch before your very eyes. If you have the opportunity to get involved in that, you should. And so I did. And I looked for an opportunity. I found one at the Cannabis. I knew somebody who worked at the Denver Post from some work I did previously in Austin, gave him a call, and, who really matters a lot of times. Luckily, I was able to get a really great opportunity at the Cannabis, and I joined the industry very quickly.
Absolutely. And in doing so, you first set out, again, starting with, did you start first with Cannabis?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Cannabis.
Yeah, so the Cannabis is a publication within the Denver Post. The Denver Post is a multi-Pulitzer Prize award-winning newspaper outlet, and was the first mainstream news outlet to get into the beat of reporting on cannabis. It was started by the editor-in-chief, Ricardo Baca, whom was the music editor at the Denver Post for the previous 13 years before they started this property. And when it started, it brought so much legitimacy to the news and the reporting coming from the cannabis industry. It was arguably one of the only real super journalistically responsible and ethical sources of news in the cannabis industry. And so when I joined, they really needed someone to help kind of steer the business of it, help generate revenues, market the brand, do a number of the things that happen on the business side of publication, not the editorial side. And that's what the general manager position was that I took over for. So, my background in startup ownership and working in media and content really sort of made me an irregular hire for that position, which is normally just a sales position. But, I was able to breathe some of my previous career into this role and kind of help raise the level of the brand itself nationally. So it was one of the most respected brands in cannabis journalism out there. It still exists to this day, but it's not what it used to be.
Well, why did it kind of come to an end? Not an end, but it definitely transformed into something new.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not news to say that the journalism industry is, definitely dealing with a lot of transition problems in the world of digital. One of those problems is that a lot of giant conglomerates own, local newspapers, and they make decisions based on how to increase profitability, usually by making cost-cutting measures and laying off work staff and, selling off things until they declare a thing bankrupt, right? It's called vulture capitalism in the journalism industry, and, the Denver Post is certainly no exception. So the Cannabis itself, while it was actually generating profitable revenue for the first time ever while I was leading it, was still just not enough of a line item for them on their long list of line items that they were looking to cross off in any given period. And just like out of nowhere, completely after they had invested a bunch of money into it, they just reversed course and were just like, nope, we're going to go ahead and axe the whole staff. So they laid off all of the sales positions. They dissolved my position. Shortly thereafter, they laid off the editor-in-chief and then the remaining reporters, and now it's just sort of a property within the Denver Post that's managed by The Wire. News just kind of populates through bots, and whatever the Denver Post actually writes about the topic will get posted there. But outside of that, it has no dedicated staff like it used to.
Gotcha. And so there really isn't a forum for that now anywhere, is there?
Well, there is actually. Since the Cannabis sort of started to lead in this place, a number of different other mainstream newspapers started to jump into it. I mean, very quickly thereafter, I think SF Gate in San Francisco and the SF Chronicle, I think they had jumped into it with their own cannabis properties. And then outside of just like, you've also got the Boston Globe doing it, the Washington Post, I think Politico now has a dedicated cannabis reporter, as well as CNN. In fact, Alicia Wallace, who used to be one of the reporters at the Denver Post who worked exclusively on the cannabis, is now reporting on cannabis for CNN. So a lot of these other mainstream news properties started to pick up the ball with this and realize this beat was serious. And then also a lot of the cannabis publications that had existed previously that weren't really well known for this started to hire much more credible journalists to write for them. So now you get great, hard-hitting investigative journalism coming from like Leafly, which previously was just an information source for strains. So yeah, it's definitely like it's blown up now. There are a lot of credible sources you can turn to. It's not just one, which is a good thing.
And that's probably now with the dissolution of the Cannabis, that's what sent you down the path of Confident Cannabis. Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself, sort of in a new industry without a position, and luckily had built such a network of people in the industry so quickly that I was able to just rely on that network again for finding my next opportunity. Took a few months. I had to do a little bit of consulting here and there to pay the bills, but eventually one of the other operators I know in the space introduced me to the founders here at Confident Cannabis. And over the next couple of months, I got to know them, talk with them a little bit about what their needs were. and then they recruited me to California.
Okay. Now you're doing some work right now in Michigan, is that right?
That is, yeah. That is right. We've launched our wholesale platform. It started first in Oregon last year, and then we just launched it in Michigan this summer. And we've been working a lot with, oddly, with caregivers there, more so than with licensed businesses, because Michigan's in a weird little space as a cannabis state.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Michigan. You're doing a lot of work there, trying to ensure that it's a well-represented industry across the board. Is that right?
Yeah. Michigan is it's one of the more interesting cannabis markets out there. Very unique. I'm always interested in these states where you find a large working class population and a lot of blue collar workers, of a diverse population, because these are the states where cannabis is arguably needed the most, particularly for its medicinal properties. And Michigan has just a fervor for this. There's definitely a demand. In Michigan's first year, they were already as large of a market as Oregon was 4 years into their legal market. So just to give your listeners a sense of what that means, Oregon's one of the most amazing states for cannabis. They grow the best cannabis in the world, in my opinion, and they have plenty of people who consume it. But that state has been legal since 2014, and Michigan just became legal this year, and they're already performing at the same level as Oregon. So there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of growth that's going to happen. But where they are currently is in a massive undersupply market. What that means is that there's just not enough cannabis being grown. And if you go to a retail store, most of anywhere in Michigan, you're going to find very few options of flower that you can buy on the shelves. I went to one of the more established dispensary, they call them provisioning centers in Detroit, and I had 5 options of flower, and that was it. And I'm used to, 25 to sometimes as much as 150 options of flower, depending on what state I'm in and what retail store I'm in. So 5 was shocking. That was very, very little. So we've been trying to help them get over this problem, right? We have a wholesale marketplace. Retailers should be able to source and buy cannabis from licensed producers, but when there's no cannabis to be found, where do they turn to? How do they provide options to their patients? And so what's happened recently is the governing body of Michigan has allowed for their medical caregivers, of which there are 40,000 in the state who produce cannabis for patients, to have a pathway to take their cannabis and move it through a licensed cultivator or processor to get it tested. And once it passes testing, the way the state forces all things to pass testing, then it can actually enter the licensed market. And so we've been helping find good quality, tested, safe cannabis from the caregiver market to establish with different licensed partners that we're connected to help give them the supply that they don't know how to find.
So these individual caregivers are allowed to grow, I get clearly, on their own. And then How do they then, ramp up to be able to provide? How many licenses are in the state of Michigan now? 2,000?
Yeah, it's actually under 2,000. They just passed through a bevy of licenses through emergency provisions because it was taking so long to get license processed. So I think they were sitting at 1,000. They passed about 500 through, and there's another 500 looking to be passed soon. So it will be at 2,000 quickly, but right now it's functionally really just 1,000.
And that 1,000 licenses
getting up and running as it is. Sorry.
Okay, that's 1,000 licenses for dispensaries, for processing, and for cultivating?
That's right. That's all of that combined. There are more provisioning centers than there are any other individual category. So I think of that, you might, don't quote me here, but maybe it's something in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 licenses are cultivators specifically. Might be a little bit more than that, but even at their max capacity, they just can't fill that amount of stores. And of those 500 emergency licenses that just got passed, a lot of those are going to be retail centers that are going to be up and running well before the cultivators, because it's just a shorter pathway to getting a business started to open up a store versus, putting in all the infrastructure and design and then growing cannabis and then harvesting it and drying it and curing it and then getting it tested and then selling it. That's at shortest a 9-month path, usually a 1.5 to 2 year path for a cultivator to get up and running. So there's going to be more demand than there will be supply sooner rather than later. The problem's not going to solve itself other than tapping into this caregiver supply and finding a pathway for it to be safe and compliant, and then connecting retailers to that supply, which is what we've been having to do a lot.
And the caregivers, now, they can provide product to individual patients. They
Correct.
can't wholesale. Is that right? Is that how it works?
Correct. That is how it works. Yeah. It's very similar to California's medical market from like 95 through, just 2 years ago or last year, where you have, it can be any person who just signs up to be a caregiver. Like they do have a special caregiver designation, but once you do that, you have a plant count you're allowed to grow to. And depending on however many patients that you grow for, you can increase that plant count. So if I think each caregiver is allowed to grow up to 72 plants, and then caregivers can form little co-ops where they all grow together, and they have a bevy of patients that they service. They're not allowed to sell into the regulated market. Like that's how the regulated market was established. So effectively, they're sort of like cut out. But the problem is that the regulated market didn't provide enough cannabis. So the state was like, we're not providing our mandate to our patients. Like our patients need options. We need to make sure they have options. So there's a temporary memo that they released that allows for this pathway for caregivers to get their product into licensed stores, and it has to be processed through an actual existing licensee and go through compliance testing. But it's a temporary fix, and it's intended to be a temporary fix. In the future, say a year from now, caregivers are going to be pushed sort of out of the Michigan market. I don't know where it's going to stand in terms of allowing them to continue to grow for patients. That there might be some level where that's allowed, but the executive director of the regulatory group in Michigan is, in almost certain terms, said we're not making room for caregivers in the regulated market.
Well, there is a big push, though, now to ensure, though, that there's equity in getting women, people of color, who are probably a lot of those caregivers, into part of the industry. And that's something that you've been working on, right?
Yeah. So that's the other thing that makes Michigan pretty unique, is that of all the states who have initiated equity licensing programs, Michigan has actually stated that they want to have 50% of all of the state's licenses be issued to equity applicants. That's way more inclusion than any state has declared that they're trying to achieve with their program. And I think that's pretty interesting. Michigan's got like the right sort of foundation for that to happen, but there needs to be more meat to the skeleton, so to speak, on that program to make it really effective. And that meat comes in the form of dollars, right? The equity programs that exist across the nation for cannabis are the start of what hopefully should be blossom into a robust way to kind of correct the war on drugs and the victims of the war on drugs. We've, as a society, we have punished and stricken down the ability for wealth to be generated in so many communities because of the war on drugs, that even if we provide a pathway to people of color getting licenses within the cannabis industry, which requires expungement of records and requires allowing for previous felons to still be able to get a license, which are things that are not generally popular amongst the authorities in any given state. Once you get them there, they have to go through this long process of licensing and applications and making sure that they're setting their properties up for code and that they can pass regulatory audits and inspections, all of which are very expensive. But then they also still need money to start their businesses. And when you're talking about communities where, so many fathers have been put in prison, unjustly for cannabis that is now legal in these states, there's a loss in income and a loss in value accrued for that family to be able to invest in themselves, for their communities to be able to invest in their neighbors. And so one of the things that we're trying to help do is promote and support programs that are bringing money to the table. And we just started our corporate social responsibility strategy within Confident Cannabis, which is basically our strategy as a company to be a good citizen, to do right, to give back. It's not just where we're going to donate money and then put out press releases about where we donated money. It's actually going to be a lot more about where we donate time and efforts to help support, mentor, and then also fund these different equity applicants. And so we've already identified 2 different organizations that we're going to start working with. one of which puts money right back into the hands of equity licensees in Portland, and one that works with equity applicants in Oakland to help them get started. And we're going to continue to identify these different opportunities across the board. We haven't yet found one that we're going to work with in Michigan, but we will very shortly. And yeah, it's a major effort and a major initiative for us as a company to not just put money behind this, but to also get our employees involved in giving back and providing a pathway for people of color and for women to have a more inclusive industry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you say you have not identified one in Michigan yet?
Not yet. No. But we are actively pursuing that. We're evaluating a number of those organizations right now. The phase with which we're at in our corporate social responsibility is specifically the identify and start connecting with organizations phase. It's not the official title, but that's what we're currently working on. So we've started looking at a number of different organizations. We haven't really been able to connect with any of them and have meaningful conversations quite yet, but that is very much on the forefront of our minds for 2020.
Okay, sure. Tell me a little bit about Confident Cannabis's new offering. It's called Connect.
Yeah,
the
Connect.
3D mapping system.
Yeah, Connect is my favorite thing as a cannabis nerd. When you said earlier that the number one problem in the industry is lack of education for consumers specifically, if not also for businesses, Connect is our way of trying to provide as much of that as we possibly can about cannabis chemistry. The premise here is that you can tell people, here's a strain of cannabis, it's called strawberry cough. And then here's another strain of cannabis, somebody else grew it, it's also called strawberry cough. And that patient or that consumer might think those two things are going to be the same, when they're not the same. And the reason they're not the same is because cannabis is, as a plant, it grows in a lot of different ways, and the genetics of that plant aren't necessarily the best predictor as to what the chemistry of that final product is going to look like. So essentially, the way cannabis makes us feel, the effect it gives us, or the conditions it treats, that effect is provided by a combination of different compounds, cannabinoids and terpenes, which are like the smells and the flavors and the aromas, the essential oils of the plant, plus the active chemicals. And those proportions of each of those chemicals is different all across the board, from plant to plant, from grower to grower, from strain to strain. And so the idea here is that, like, as patients and as consumers, we should be able to predict what effect we're going to have from the cannabis that we're buying because, while it smells and tastes great, we're buying it for effect. And it's really hard for people to predict what that effect is. One of the largest growing segments of consumers in the cannabis industry are seniors, and seniors really need to be able to predict the effect of what they're trying to buy, especially if they're trying to treat a specific condition. If they get cannabis that makes them panicky or makes them loopy, makes them feel irresponsible, they're not going to continue to use it, but it might be a very, very, very strong help to whatever problem that they're dealing with. And so Connect takes all of the lab chemistry data that we get from all the labs across the United States and looks at just cannabis flower, because that's the one that has the most question marks in terms of what you should expect. Takes just cannabis flower that has been tested for the full realm of cannabinoids and terpenes, and puts them into a space where you can see which ones are chemically the same, which ones are chemically dissimilar, where the cannabis market sort of tends to be grouping in terms of chemistry. You can see where the CBD strains out there live by their color. They're the pink and purple and blue strains that kind of live in an island away from the rest of the green strains, which are high THC strains. And so what we did was we took all this data and we put it into a visual format, which is like this 3D map called Connect. And you can explore the cannabis strain universe essentially this way by seeing all the different types of strains that we have that are in wide circulation, that are trading in all of these 8 different states that we currently showcase. And you can see what chemicals are in those plants. You can find out, for instance, that indica and sativa don't mean anything chemically, but that's how 98% of cannabis is bought and sold. So there's this education portion that needs to be unlocked about cannabis, which is getting past the myths that we currently hold about how cannabis works and what effects you should expect. Oh, if you want to feel, peppy, you just need sativa. If you want to feel, sedated and like sleeping on the couch, you need indica. as if the cannabis effect universe is binary, and it definitely isn't.
Without
Connect is our best way of
without a doubt.
showcasing that. Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the industry needs to start focusing on to not only, reach out to attract a larger number of consumers, but at the same time to be more responsible.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times I've heard bud tenders make suggestions to people looking for help for medical conditions based on just, man, this stuff is fire. It's 27% THC. Right. And it drives me crazy because I'm like, you guys are sort of acting like nurses in this environment. You're not like bartenders. You don't go to a bar and say, hey, bartender, I've been dealing with this like serious migraine issue my whole life. I don't really know what to do. I've turned to everything and nothing works. What whiskey do you suggest?
Right, and then at the same time, trying to give the impression that one particular brown liquor is different than another particular brown liquor when you have no idea what's in it. That's
right. That's exactly right. Yes. So, I use cannabis a lot, and I love flower. So I'm a huge flower nerd. I smoke as much of it as I can, and I use it for a litany of different reasons. But a lot of it is for medication reasons, and then a lot of it's just for fun.
I have been on record as saying that the majority of people out here who even recreationally use don't even admit to or don't recognize that recreational use and their choice of cannabis over liquor was probably based on some sort of underlying medical issue that, albeit it may not be a profound medical issue, but it might be the fact that I just want to feel a little bit better. I want to feel a little bit better. I want to be able to relax. I want to be able to sleep better. And those are underlying medical issues.
That's right. Yeah, I think I've even heard another person agree with you on this that has a big profile in the industry. Steve D'Angelo, I believe, said once that all cannabis use is medicinal.
I've been saying that now for like almost 10 years myself.
Totally, yeah. And there are a number of people in the industry that agree with that position. The fact of the matter is that, like, if I had been born maybe in 1985 instead of 1980, I probably would have been diagnosed with ADD and put on Ritalin. But instead, I've had to, throughout my life, navigate my own issues of procrastination and distraction and, inability to focus on one thing, and have to harness that in a number of ways. But when I found cannabis, all of that sort of, I can now medicate throughout the day, focus on my work, get work done and to a high level, and then go home and connect with my wife and have some fun smoking some weed. But I still know that like those levels of distraction that my brain are apt to pull itself into are going to be sort of subdued by me using cannabis, whether it's recreational or not. My brain's not going to make that choice for me. It's something that it needs. It's something that helps it. So yeah, I totally see that, and I think that that's kind of how we should start thinking about cannabis across the board. One of the things
I do with the show on this podcast is to make sure that people are educated enough to know that when you make statements like that, Brad, you're not making a statement like that based on just your own personal use. I know you did research the same way I did, and a lot of people have done. But for those that are listening and tuning in right now, you have to understand that the federal government has done research on this also, and had research that has been documented and published. This isn't something that we're just, I and Brad are just sitting back shooting the crap about. The U.S. government owns a patent right now on CBD and on cannabinoids. As a matter of fact, it's a patent that you can look up yourself and understand that they wrote in their patent abstract. Here, I'm going to read you a little bit of it right this second so you understand when statements like this are made, we're not just talking trash. We're telling you what the U.S. government agreed to themselves. As a matter of fact, in the U.S. government patent 6630507B1, in that patent, they have an abstract. And what the abstract is the paragraph or paragraphs that describe why they believe enough in whatever it is that they've asked for a patent in. They give you the actual medical research that they've done. And in the U.S. patent abstract for 6630507B, it states, cannabinoids have been found to have antioxidant properties unrelated to MDMA receptor antagonism. This newfound property makes cannabinoids useful in the treatment of prophylaxis of a wide variety of oxidative or oxidation-associated diseases such as ischemic, age-related inflammatory autoimmune diseases. The cannabinoids are found to have particular application as neuroprotectants, for example, in limiting neurodegenerative or neurological damage following ischemic insults such as stroke, trauma, and in the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, HIV, dementia. Non-psychoactive cannabinoids such as cannabidiol are particularly advantageous to use because they avoid toxicity that is encountered with psychoactive cannabinoids such as in high doses. So these are words that our government wrote and researched, not just coming out of Brad Montel. But go ahead, Brad. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, what I really love about that research that the government did was that initially it was set out to show what a menace cannabis really was. I think the government had 3 separate studies done during the rise of the war on drugs to try to bolster their argument that cannabis was a menace. And each and every time, their own studies came back and showed it had great medicinal value. They just
and this is back in 2003, folks. This is back as far as 2003. This isn't yesterday. This isn't 2019. Right. I'm talking 2003. And our government spent, $50 million to $100 million doing research in places like Israel and other places around the world, like you said, Brad, to disprove any medical efficacy for cannabis. And they came back basically extolling and saying the exact opposite.
Exactly. Because at this point, it feels obvious, which is kind of a funny place to be in, considering the history that we grew up in. But the fact that this was happening during the same time that my parents were having it drilled into their brain that there was not only no medicinal value to cannabis, but that it was actively destroying brain cells in our brains. I grew up in the DARE program, where it was constantly, it was just fried eggs over and over and over in front of my face. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
Right.
And it's such nonsense. I know.
Especially,
it's so funny to look back at.
But it's especially such a joke knowing that the same, your parents, my parents, friends of mine, people that I know, even myself, we ran around here, vilifying cannabis, not knowing that our government was spending the money validating its efficacy.
That's right. Hey, look, I'll hold myself accountable. I used to be straight edge in high school, and I actively judged anyone who smoked weed or did any sort of any other drugs. I looked at it as weak. I thought that it was, succumbing to a controlling substance. I could not have been more wrong myself. And it's funny that when I hang out with some of my old college friends and high school friends, and they see me smoking weed now and also being a part of the industry, they're sort of like, who are you?
Right. Well, I got to tell you, 100% disclosure, people know that, I did a 17-year television talk show that was born out of me traveling around the country for 3 years, speaking in high schools all across this country, telling kids to stay away from drugs, stay away from negative youth trends.
Yeah.
And became extremely popular because of that platform. And now I look back at that and realize some of the mistakes that I made and some of the false information that I was putting out. And at the same time that I was doing that, getting awards from the U.S. government for doing it, the U.S. government was spending money researching the efficaciousness of cannabis, which is just really ridiculous.
That's so wacky, man. Yeah. It's kind of magical to reverse from these positions, isn't it? Like the
Absolutely.
fact that I feel like I had such conviction, earlier on, and I thought I was intelligent and educated in that conviction, and it was just based and predicated off of lies and propaganda. And when you can see that, I was just saying when you can see that from the other side, it's magical. It's like you've awakened from a bad dream, and you see very clearly, that layer of where lies are told and where profit motives sort of line up with, government agendas around these types of things. You start to understand a little bit more about the prison industrial complex and what the war on drugs really ultimately has meant for the U.S. government. People say that the war on drugs was a failure, and I don't think it was a failure at all, because it never was a war on drugs. It was a war on people, and they succeeded greatly in that war, and so greatly that to try to get out of those ills is so difficult. But
right, because they made so much money. They made so much money and created businesses in this country that was based on wars on people.
That's right. Yeah, and that's where all of this comes from. So yeah, the fact that they were giving you awards while also doing the research is just like that extra slap in the face about it, isn't it?
Oh, no question. And it's so freeing and so revelatory being able to now be a part of this industry in teaching people how to navigate a space that is good for their health and wellness that we now know. I mean, 100% disclosure. Yeah. I have product in the marketplace right now under my own brand that I've had out now for a couple of years, and we're rebranding. As a matter of fact, as we speak, I'm creating a brand new product that is now called Live Better by Montel. I was doing Lenotec by Montel, but I have now a product that's called Live Better, which is both THC and CBD products. But I also, like yourself, like you've explained, and I'm so glad that you guys are doing this, especially with your Connect platform, where you're literally taking a look at product and flower available. Now, I happen to be a Keef user, and I've been a Keef smoker for now almost 17 years, long before it was vogue, long before people, back in the day when people were like, here, you can take this. I don't want this Keef. Well,
that's right.
literally, getting Keef at 20, 30, 40, 50% off, back in the day when I was saying, do you happen to have any that has, this is back almost 18 years ago, trying to find high CBD products when people are going, you can have this, and when most people don't even know that, the United States, farmers literally tried their best to grow the CBD out of the plant during the 60s and the 70s, trying to see if they could achieve the highest THC levels that they could possibly achieve. I was actually looking for a product like that back in 2001, 2002, 3, and 4, when most people were turning against it, because I recognized back then, having done some of the research back then and seeing what Dr. Michaud and others were doing, and discovering the pathways that opened up in the brain, and also looking at terpene profiles, and ensuring that terpenes that are something that are identified in plants other than cannabis than the cannabis plant.
It's wild, isn't it?
That had already been recognized for medicinal benefits and for having attributes that made for either more bioavailability of the cannabinoids. So this is something that I'm glad that you have been working on and really trying your best to raise the level, not just for consumers, but also for the businesses out there, to make them understand what it is they are providing to and putting in front of consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that using Connect has helped me as a cannabis consumer really fine-tune what I'm looking for, when, and why. I know very specifically now what combination of terpenes and cannabinoids send me off in a panic and make me fuzzy-headed and unproductive. And I know exactly which ones are going to help me to focus and help me actually medicate for, my attention deficit and be productive. And I figured that out sort of leading up to the development of Connect, just by smelling and journaling. Every single time I would try a new strain, I would smell it. I would journal whether it made me feel good or not good. And I started to figure out that orange smells of flower tended to give me a bad reaction, and lemon smells tended to make me like classically stoned and laugh at bad movies. Whereas if it smelled a little bit fruitier, more like berries, I knew it would help me focus. But those are the strains that mostly, quote unquote, put people in the couch, right? And so like I knew brain chemistry was playing a part in this, because my wife and I had different reactions to the same strains of cannabis. So absolutely. So I knew that our brain chemistry had to play a portion of it. And then I also knew that, some different combination of smells was signaling to me whether something was going to have the right profile I was looking for. But it wasn't until I was able to apply that journaling and that experience to Connect and figure out that it's terpinolene that I need to avoid specifically as a terpene, and THCV as a cannabinoid generally tends to show up in the strains that make me feel bad. So I've started to learn what the actual lexicon is around this and why it matters, and understanding the proportion of cannabinoids and terpenes in their entourage effect is a very unique and a very personal experience. We can't tell anyone right now what a certain product will make them feel like. And there are a number of companies out there doing this. They'll say like, oh, if
Correct.
you use this, this is calm. If you use this, this is, euphoric. But we don't really know that that's actually going to be the experience someone has because
for the
our brain
individual.
chemistry.
Yeah, for
Right.
the individual. Now, I have a product out that I call Relax and Alert. And for me, I say unequivocally that this works for me. It's my brain chemistry that it works
That's
for.
right.
You need to try it out and see if you get the same effect. Now, I'll tell you, I've had a pretty universal response, but every now and then, once in a while, I'll get one person who will say, I tried that alert, man. It knocked me on my ass. I'm like, how did it knock you on your ass? I don't understand how that happened. But you have to understand that your brain chemistry and what you ate this morning is different than what I ate this morning. And
Right.
it may affect you differently just the way you metabolize.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, also, what prescription drugs might you be on if you're taking this
Correct.
at the same time? Have you had alcohol in the last week? All
Correct.
these things are going to affect our experience with it. And like there's the pharmaceutical world has gotten to a point where they will tell you, here's what a thing does, and then here's all the things that it will also do in some people. Usually a very small, very minute, rare amount of people will experience X amount of these different litany of things. Right? We're fast approaching the world where cannabis is going to be spoken about in the same terms. I don't think it's an irresponsible thing for a company to say this will make you calm, particularly when they've done a ton of research and have been able to identify that 99.5% of individuals are going to feel calm, right? Like, that's great. Cannabis flower is a little harder to nail down in that regard, but even still,
Right.
if you've got such a finite control over all of your inputs and outputs as a grower, you may be able to stabilize your grow chemically so that you are able to produce that over and over and over again and have done the research to prove it. It's just like we're lacking the medical research,
I agree. And I think one of the things that we're also shying away from and trying to avoid is that, again, now that we do have techniques to extract terpenes, we have techniques to extract certain cannabinoids, there are ways for us to manipulate even flower when we offer it up for sale by adding a little bit back. You can add a little keef that's in that has, maybe a different profile, sprinkle that over your flower so that, you lift the level, reduce the level, like you said, terpenoline, and, you can actually increase the level of beta-caryophyllene. You can increase levels in there just by adding a little bit, and there's no reason why we aren't doing that.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. How did you, if you don't mind me asking you a question, how did you find the right combination of cannabinoids and terpenes to help you to treat what you were looking for?
In a way, almost exactly the way you did without doing the extra journaling, but that was literally finding strains, and trying them. I shifted over to keef, and then when I went from keef, I went to some extracts. But I primarily right now, I will consume a little keef this afternoon. Keef is my go-to because, I think that's where the highest concentration of the majority of the cannabinoids are. And I can, I know that I can, with keef, I can just sprinkle out just a couple little dots, throw that in a bowl, and that's enough for me. That handles and gets me through. You know what I mean?
That's
but
great.
I did the same thing, and that's really by, trial and error. Finding, but then, I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that really just ticked me off is that, I would go to a particular keef strain and use that for 3 or 4 months, go back and pick up the same keef from the same dispensary, and then go, what the hell is this? This isn't the same thing. But the claim is, but no. What happens is that new batch of flower that was keefed actually produced a different profile.
That's right.
And what people have to understand, so then I'd have to take that keef and mix it with some remnants of some of the keef that I had before to elicit the same response.
Yeah.
And then as I started getting that tested, then I started realizing, I know what I got here.
Yeah, and this is what makes flower so hard to nail down. When you're dealing with blended concentrates, you can very easily control the blend of things that are in that concentrate, depending on how you're extracting it.
Correct.
But, certain vape pen concentrates are blends of cannabinoids and terpenes that are blended specifically. It's not just like, hey, we blasted this out of the plant and this is what the plant had. and we're just running with it. It's really like, no, we wanted to create this specific profile, and so we finely tuned it, and here you go. And you can get consistency out of those products time and time and time and time again. But flower is so variable, and not only is flower variable from harvest to harvest, it's variable from plant to plant. The actual, like, you could take a top bud off of a plant and a bottom bud off of a plant and test them both separately and find a slight variation in the chemistry off of the same plant alone, let alone one plant from one side of the field to another, let alone if you make a change in your growing medium or in your fertilizer, or if just the sun happens to have a different, there's more cloud cover in one given season than the one before it. Like, those are all going to affect how the cannabis is grown. So, indoor growers. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but that's all why I'm also kind of, I call it a formulator, but I'd rather take a harvest and put it together, and then take a look at all those buds. Now, I'm also one of these people who's more of a purist. I don't believe in trimming nugs down to these little, finger size little bud and throwing away the rest. I'd rather take a larger quantity of the natural plant. And, if I have to, for me personally, I do a real quick, rough grind and then test that overall grind rather than just one bud.
Yep. So labs do the same thing. It's called homogenizing the sample. And they'll take a homogeneous sample to test, and they'll say this test result stands for this given crop, right? When those test results are taken in, we get all that data, and then we produce Connect. And one of the reasons why we produce this visualization was to show this variability. When you look at Connect, you see this sort of like range of color in any given cannabinoid or terpene. And what that's showing you is that from harvest to harvest, from test result to test result, this grower is producing a range of potency around THC or CBD or terpinolene or beta-caryophyllene, that it's not always going to be the exact same thing over and over and over and over and over again. That there's even a range between test result to test result, and then from strain to strain. So it's really like trying to give the power of that education to the consumer. The thing is that it does require the same process you and I went through of journaling and experiencing, different ways that cannabis affects you and remembering what those associated smells or characteristics were. Connect is a great map to help you navigate through that. And really start to understand what you're smelling versus just like, oh, this smells gassy. I think I like gassy stuff. It's giving you a little bit more of a refined palate. Think of it like wine tasting. When you start tasting wine initially, it just tastes like sort of vinegary alcohol. And then slowly but surely you start to pull out things like tannins, and then you can get really specific and kind of stupid with your language and like, oh, I smell sweet, damp earth and toasted leather.
Right. Well, that's what you have to do to be a discerning consumer. And Brad, I got to tell you, man, you and I could talk to you for days, and I'd love to have you come back. Please, I got to have you come back.
Yeah, man.
On Let's Be Blunt with Montel, because I think our listeners are going to really appreciate the work that you've been doing. I got to ask you one more question because I think we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to make this one too long so people don't listen. But what's the future, my brother? What do you got planned in the next couple of months?
Well, we're launching our wholesale platform in California, which is going to be a big initiative. California as a state is often talked about as one cannabis market, but it's really like 3 or 4 cannabis markets. I mean, it's totally different from NorCal to SoCal to Sacramento. So we're going to be really helping the California market out over the next 6 months of the year, while opening up probably a few other states. We'll be launching our initiatives on our corporate social responsibility strategy. So maybe whenever I come back, I can give you an update as to where we're at with that and what's been going on.
Absolutely.
On the chemistry front, one of the interesting trends that we're noticing right now is the rise of CBG. For your listeners, like CBD, but it's neuroregenerative actually, rather than neuroprotective.
Can I tell you something? This is really funny. The fact that you say that, I kid you not, over 2.5 years ago, when I was formulating my first products, I was literally beating some growers and beating some formulators over the head saying, listen to me, in the next 2 to 3 years, CBG will start becoming one of the more important cannabinoids out there. And they said, well, why? Well, because CBG, for those people out there who don't know, CBG is really what turns into THC, THCA, THCV, CBD, CBDV. It's and for the first 6 weeks of grow, when you're growing a cannabis plant, if you tested it, pulled it out of the ground and tested it then, you'd find that you barely find any THC at all, very, very, very low levels, because it's the CBG that turns into CBD, turns into THC. So in a way, CBG is kind of like a stem cell cannabinoid, and it's a stem cell that turns into other things. Well, that's also what's going to be the power of helping to modulate the effects of THC and CBD down the road. But people need to pay attention to this, and they haven't been. And so I've been really, really, really just beating my manufacturers and my formulators over the head, saying we've got to get ahead of this. And I'm so glad you even brought that up.
Dude, Church, you called it. You literally called it, because that's exactly right. It is also called the God cannabinoid for that reason. It sort of gives birth to all the others, and it's existed somewhat on the hemp side of the market, but we're starting to see a number of different cultivators actually trying to create CBG dominant THC plants. And
they should, and even in the CBD side or the hemp side of the house, you find CBG really prevalent in the hemp plant in its first 4 to 5 weeks. Why are we not harvesting some of these early on and extracting, taking it out, adding it back into, or even spraying it over some of the flower that we have to increase the viability and bioavailability of the THC and THCA? It's really kind of just ignorant to me that we haven't been doing this, but I think that's
it's happening.
On the horizon.
It's picking up now. Yeah, it's picking up now, and we're getting a lot of demand from buyers looking for CBG now in the states that we're running wholesale. We're seeing a lot more CBG showing up in testing results, and we know a number of different cultivators who are trying to breed these things. So I think the rise of CBG is upon us, along with THCV. That one also has been identified as a pretty popular cannabinoid, supposedly for its appetite suppression abilities, which we still need to, of course, do the research on. But those two cannabinoids are getting a lot of buzz lately, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of it.
And we're going to also, I'll throw it out here at you now, but CBN is going to become a cannabinoid that people are going to be reaching out to, especially for its relaxing and its sleep aid ability. We're going to start to see a little bit more of that. So when you're looking at, CBD products with a little bit, we're not talking about having to raise the level of CBN up to 12 and 13 and 14 and 15%.
You don't need that.
Raise the level up now. Raise the level up to 1 or to 1.1%. And that little addition will help give you for some, not all, but for some, will give some people a more of a relaxing feeling in even their CBD product with no THC whatsoever. So, Brad, I'm going to say thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, man.
No, I want to thank you.
I know a lot of people that use cannabis use it for sleep. I think that's one of the more reported desired effects of cannabis, and I think you're spot on about that. CBN doesn't need to be super big. It doesn't need to be super potent. THC doesn't, for that matter, but CBN is going to be definitely much more on the rise, because it's just one of the things that most people use it for. So I totally agree with you there.
Absolutely, my friend. Well, look, I thank you so much for being a part of today's Let's Be Blunt with Montel, and I'm going to make sure all of you listening out there, make sure you tune in to our next edition of Let's Be Blunt. And hopefully, Brad, you'll be back. Come on back, my brother. Let's talk a little bit more. Even having a conversation about, the breakdown of the different cannabinoids would be great.
Love it, man.
All right, man. You be well. Take care of yourself. And thank you all again for tuning in to Let's Be Blunt with Montel.